We're going to pick up chapter 8 with some of the nuts and bolts of budgeting, and I'm going to try and get through all of this in one video, so hang on. The budget is really our financial structural master plan, both long-term and short-term, for our operations. We've got a plan. We've got to come up. We can't just fly by the seat of our pants. We got to then compare what we planned to how well we executed. We're going to have a budget director and then a budget committee that's going to assess and monitor our budgeting process and execution. Now, we're going to have a master budget, and this is going to have lots of sort of subunits. But within that, you're going to have operating budgets and financial budgets. Additionally, we don't want to just sort of January 1, we have our budget, and then we don't look at anything again until maybe December of the next year. We want to always be looking 12 months ahead at where we're at from where we're currently at. So that we don't end up, at the end of our year, not having a budget for next month yet, for example. Now, the components, as I said, of the master budget are going to be both operational and financial, and this is a little flow chart that talks about all of these pieces. Within an operating budget, you're going to have your sales and your production. And now we talk about this in terms of manufacturing, but this could certainly be just as applicable to something service related as well. How many hours does somebody have to bill in order to meet various targets? You've got to have a direct materials purchases budget. And if you think back, early in the term where you guys watched the video on Stein Meats, this was a really major part of their issue, is that they had no direct materials budget. They had somebody just placing orders without any real sense of how that fit in the overall scheme. Plus, you've got to have direct labor that makes sure that you're not ordering enough materials to keep your labor force busy, and so does that mean you need to cut back on labor hours? You got to have your overhead budget to make sure that you're not going overboard on overhead costs, and know what your finished ending finished goods in inventory is. What do you project to have? And if you've got more finished goods in inventory, in other words, you've got lots of excess sitting in your warehouse, you need to rethink that. Now, I say all that on the heels of lots of product shortages from the just-in-time manufacturing, where we saw, weeks on end of no toilet paper. So I think it's important to not, cut that finished goods inventory too tightly, because there's really no room for any hiccups in the supply chain if that happens. Additionally, you've got to pay attention to what your marketing and administrative budget is. How many advertising dollars? What is your customer acquisition cost? Those are important things to know. And then, is your marketing targeted most efficiently toward that customer acquisition cost? Do you have R&D? And is your R&D budget aligned with your long-term goals? And then you should have a budgeted income statement. And those are really the components for the operating budget. We then get to the financial budget, which has really more of a kind of a long-term feel to it, and less, again, the day-to-day stuff. We're going to be looking at capital expenditures. We're also going to look at our cash budget. And here's sort of an example, and I don't want to confuse this with a statement of cash flows. This is really our forecast for what we expect in terms of cash. And thinking back to the Stein Meats example, if I remember correctly, they had to pay their suppliers I think in 10 days or 30 days, whatever it was a pretty short window. On the other hand, they had outstanding receivables from their own customers that went on for years. So there was a huge disconnect between the cash that had to go out and the cash that was expected to come in. And having a cash budget that's prepared, that is real, based in reality, helps to prevent those kinds of situations. So you will also have a budgeted balance sheet, as well as your budgeted statement of cash flows, in addition to, again, just your cash budget. Now, what we've been talking about is basically the traditional budgeting process, and there are shortcomings with that, as with many things. It is often fairly static, not dynamic. It's not kind of changing in real time, and it is results oriented. In other words, management performance may be based on this, and there may not necessarily be a link between what management's doing and how these numbers are being generated, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. A trend away from the traditional budget is a flexible budget, and what a flexible budget does is it anticipates output or production within a range, and then it kind of works backwards from that range. So we know, for example, that if we have X amount of output, that within a range, we know that we know our direct materials are going to go up proportionally to that. So we don't want to have a direct materials budget that's working in isolation with the product demand. In other words, we don't want to be buying more raw materials than there is demand for the finished product. So we need to be assessing kind of in real time what the demand is for the product, and then making modifications as we need to ensure that we don't overbuy for what is the current demand. And so, as I said, this is a constant comparison of comparing the actual with the budgetary analysis, and often this is done using the activity-based budgeting, which is what you learned about earlier in the term. And again, this sort of is a backward-looking approach. Instead of looking forward and saying, here we are, what do we need? It says, okay, this is where we intend to end up. How do we budget to make sure that this is where we get to? The budgeting is often based on cost drivers, and it can often yield better results, although it can have its drawbacks too. So theoretically, it will work well when there's an alignment of managerial and organizational goals, although there are times when that can be thwarted. It offers opportunity for feedback and performance. Incentives can be created, although I think it's important not to create disincentives, because that can also, in my opinion, potentially result in some unethical behavior. Although at the same time, if you find that there is lack of performance in particular areas, then perhaps some overall corrective action rather than punishment may be warranted. So, if we have a good budgetary process, everybody's got a voice, and it's all leading to this goal. I was asked to put my department budget together, and I thought, I wonder how much I can get them to give me. What kinds of resources can I create? And so I'll have to get back to you on how well that works out. But this also allows for some ability within, for cost control. And I write down here, but you really have to be careful about what's going on with your mid-level management and your frontline folks to try and meet the targeted budgets. And I write, don't be Wells Fargo. Hopefully you watched the Wells Fargo video before you viewed this week's lecture slides. But in a nutshell, what Wells Fargo did was there is some metric that says basically if you open a new account for somebody, somehow that translates into more income for the institution. So they had sales targets where you had to open accounts for lots of different people. So then, somebody would go to work there and they would open an account for their brother, their sister, their mother, whatever. And in a small town, they had the same metrics for small communities that they would in downtown Los Angeles. And there is a point at which you will have saturated the market. There is no one else in some little town in the middle of nowhere who needs an account at that branch. So these folks still had the same sales targets, however, that they had. And it created an opportunity for fraudulent behavior to occur. And so I won't go into more of it, and hopefully you've watched the video, but understand that the company was fined very severely for this, as well as, well, it agreed to a settlement that cost this company billions of dollars as a result of really what was unhealthy budgeting and sales practices that it employed in its operations. And so that is all for Chapter 8.